put together a book. We decided to put together a book, and I wanted to go very academic, and she wanted to go very popular. And so we wound up working with collecting 30 people and asking them to think about the impact of this particular record album and book, which were published in 1972, and then television show, which was broadcast in 1974. And we began to think of this project as a history written in 4 voices. And like a good feminist collaborative vision, we really imagined that in fact this was a project that was collaboratively constructed. And so we began to think about the history of the originators, what we call the originators of this, and that it was headed by Marlo Thomas, who was the first female television producer. And some of you may or may, I knew her as I was growing up because I loved watching a television show called That Girl that was made in the mid-1960s. And in fact, she was sort of revolutionary in that television program in that she never married. She was a single actress, played a single actress who went to New York City and never married. The only way that she got to make that show was apparently she went to the producer. She was also the daughter of a very famous comedian, Danny Thomas, but she went to the television executive, and threw the feminine mystique on his desk and said, "You have to let me do this show this way. She does not get married." And he said, absolutely not. She said, "You read this book because I know your wife is reading it, and you will, you believe me, this is what has to happen." So she did that and produced it, and then actually afterwards, as the story goes, she wanted to read, after that television show, she was reading her niece, Dion, a bedtime story, and was looking for a children's book that would not put her niece to sleep, her mind and herself to sleep, she said. And so she began to collaborate with a number of people to rewrite the stories that were being told to children. She met with Gloria Steinem, who put her together with Letty Cotton Progerman, who was the editor for Ms. Magazine, launched in 1972, of the children's section of Ms. Magazine. From its very inception in 72, there was a section of Ms. Magazine called Stories for Free Children. And Letty Progerman was asked to edit that because in the feminist editorial collective, she obviously had the qualification to do so because she was the only member of the collective, I believe, who had children. And so she began to, and she was very interested in how do you rethink gender roles, how do you rethink sexuality from the perspective of making change. And so from its initial issues, Ms. Magazine had a section called Stories for Free Children. And as we began to put this project together, we thought what we wanted to do is to talk to the people who organized initially the project, and then to the children who were involved. So we interviewed, of the producers, Alan Alda and Marlo Thomas and Letty Progerman and Francine Klagsbrunn, who wrote the book, Carol Hall, who wrote a number of the musical pieces, Carol Hart, who was the producer. And we basically said, we're professors, you have to write your own story about how this happened. And many of them, we persuaded them to write their autobiographical account of what they had done in this project. And that was a little bit nerve-wracking to sort of call them up and say, you have to editing Gloria Steinem, for example, in terms of her involvement in this. But we then contacted and connected, or because of those connections, we talked with the children who were involved. So Letty Progerman's daughters were both in the television show. Abigail and Robin Progerman were children at the time, and they were filmed in the piece, as was Dorothy Pittman Hughes and her daughters. So we talked to them about what it was like to be a child on the set, to think about what the history was from the perspective of the maker and the children involved. And then we did the historians and sociologists section. The third voice was sort of the reflection on what difference did this make. And then as a fourth category of thinking about history, we began to think about what was the legacy. And so we contacted people we thought of as following on the heels of this vision for how you remade social roles by changing people's idea of gender. and we contacted Peggy Bernstein, who it turns out actually had been in, there was a musical as well as a record album and a television show, and she had been in the musical as a child. We contacted a woman named Cheryl Kilo Davis, who is a children's author who just wrote a book called My Princess Boy, about reframing how her son, her preschool son who likes to dress in dresses, how important it is to him to think about being beautiful and what that means. She wrote a book initially she said for his school and for his teachers, to start to come to terms with her son, who she felt she had bullied into trying to dress like a boy, to gender norm, until her older son, at the time was I think 7, said to her mom, can't we just let him be happy? And so she wrote this beautiful children's book, and we asked her to do it because apparently when she would give readings around the country, people would immediately make the connection between what she was doing and Free to Be You and Me. I asked my colleague Laura Briggs, who edits a lesbian mom blog, is the title of it, to talk about her impression of Free to Be You and Me. And she wrote a lovely autobiographical piece about her and her partner's lack of vision when they realized at some point they were called out at a preschool, a two or 3-year-old swim class by her son, who fell in love with a doll on the side of the pool, and the swim instructor, said to Laura and her partner, doesn't Jackson have a doll? And she realized, as she said, good lesbian moms that we had not sort of equipped our son to think about gender norms to change them, and so actually Jackson got a doll out of it. But we asked her to think about some of those continuing issues, and so it's really a kind of, we were thinking of this as history written in 4 voices and history written for the public, and we envisioned this as something that we hoped would be read outside of kind of the audiences that we often seek to connect with as historians. And what we found actually is that this really has given us the opportunity to make a very clear historical claim, and the claim I think we'd like to make with this book, and that I wanted to make, is that this piece, Free to Be You and Me, is as much a central text of what we sometimes call the second wave women's movement in the United States as Friedan's Feminine Mystique, or Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex. And I think that even if it's missed some people, what we do know is that this has stayed in print. It was originally made in 1972, as I said. There was a very hard time, Marlo Thomas had a very hard time finding a record company that would record the children's album. Because as one record executive said to her, why would you want to produce something by a bunch of dykes? Right? And when she was trying to get this made, it was really seen as something that was outside of the lines. She found a very small record company called Bell Records that originally printed up the album, the record album, for children, and they thought they'd sell 15,000. The record went gold. It has stayed in print. This is still one of the main gifts that people give to new mothers, especially. There's a reference to it on Sex and the City. They have a friend who gets pregnant, and in fact they buy Free to Be You and Me to give to the expectant mother. And I think it's stayed in print in part because it does speak to ways in which we really try to rethink what we understand about gender. So let me give you a little bit, if I haven't gone on too long as an historian, let me give you a little bit of a background on where this came from and what it's about. This is the book, actually, that Marlo Thomas said that she pulled out for her niece to read, for Dion to read, written by Whitney Darrow, called I'm Glad I'm a Boy, I'm Glad I'm a Girl. And the gender roles were pretty clear in this. Boys fix things and girls need things fixed. And in fact, boys invent things and girls get to use those things that boys invented. And in fact, this made a lot of people very angry about what we were teaching our young people. As I said, Letty Pogrebin, from the first issue of Ms., advocated for changing the way in which we could think about not only stories but also toys and pieces of material for our children. And eventually she collected this together in a book called Stories for Free Children. That is the reason, in fact, she became a consultant on the original record album and book. And in fact, one of the nice things about the original book is that it was written, I think, with an idea of getting it into schools in mind. There are the music is presented. There are sort of art pieces that are sort of children's art and put together. And it was a very interactive piece of text as well as a piece of music. As the Stories for Free Children organized, there was also a group, actually, of the Women's Action Alliance, the Alliance, that set a vision around change, and they were working very closely with NOW, and also with preschool educators. And one of the things I love about the Alliance is they created an agenda for equity, for making changes politically. And in their agenda, and there really was an agenda, they organized a national march in 1974. They really figured remaking children's toys as one of the most important things to do. So they actually launched a program called the Non-Sexist Child Development Program. This is Barbara Sprung, who actually answered the call for the Women's Action Alliance to head their preschool program. And Sprung was a preschool teacher who was working in New York City, who began to think that what you needed to do was to really get into the schools, to get to gender roles. The literature that she was reading said that gender roles are solidified by age 3. And so if you can change the way that children think about who they are and what they can do as they're developing in preschool, you can make a big change. And so, in fact, she launched something called the Non-Sexist Child Development Program. They ran a series of sort of test schools throughout the country and received over 5,000 letters that have been archived over at the Sophia Smith from teachers and preschool teachers and parents about their concerns around sexist image in the schools. And I know Joyce has done some work here on the group. I think you were one of the parents who organized the group in Amherst, is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. These were all over the country. And part of what WAA thought they could do, the Alliance thought they could do, was if you wanted to make people feminists, and if they were afraid to identify as a feminist, you got them through their children. Right? In fact, somebody might not be able to claim that they were a feminist, as the early kind of movement was thinking about how to extend its reach, but they really would care about what their daughter could do. And so it was seen as a way to kind of extend the group of people who would identify with other parts of the vision for equity, gender equity, pay equity, child care access, sexual civil rights. And this is an image of what Sprung created. This was she sold it to Milton Bradley. She actually originally cut these out herself. They were flannel images of non-traditional gender roles for girls and boys. And so, in fact, this is a letter carrier, and I'm not sure the distinction. I think one is a letter carrier, one is another kind of delivery person. And these were distributed throughout the country to try to get teachers to talk to kids about how they understand gender roles. I've done a little bit of work on this, actually, and it turns out that this is still the method. These are called, it's a lesson that's developed called Our Community Helpers. And around the globe, it is the first introduction that most children have to social science. So you do a kind of exercise where you talk about who are your community helpers, and you begin to elucidate who they know and who they see in their lives. And so one of the goals for this vision was that you could change the way that young women thought about careers if you changed how they saw careers in the first place, how they saw jobs and who could hold jobs. And so you can see that in, what I'd like to do now is to play a clip from Free to Be You and Me that I think sort of fits with this piece. And it was also,
that's actually one of the songs. That was Harry Belafonte and Marlo Thomas. And you can see what they're doing is they're very much playing with the roles of what people are supposed to do. But that's actually not why it was so controversial. This was made in '74. Any idea?
He's white.
This was a song that was written by Carol Hall. Carol Hall was a songwriter who actually went on to go write Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, the musical. And she was a single mom. She had wanted to support herself at writing songs, and her agent contacted her and said, Marlo Thomas is putting together a group to remake the songs of childhood. Can you put together something? And she wrote this particular song, including the funny joke tellers. Some parents are funny joke tellers, as a way of getting herself the job, right? Because Marlo Thomas's father was a comedian, and she really wanted this job. But yes, when the song was made, the issue was the fact that it looks like they're an interracial couple. ABC had to say, take that out, it won't play in the South. Marlo Thomas, because she was the first female television producer and because she was so well connected, could say, that's fine, I'll take it out. CBS wants the production. And they let her keep it in. This was produced as an ABC after-school special. We don't know what those are now, but at the time there used to be, when we only had 3 television channels, there were sort of these moments when there were special times on television for children. And I remember this, there was this sort of the annual Snoopy Halloween, Peanuts Halloween, and after-school specials were, I think, once every couple of months they would show something, and that was how this was initially made. So that's, any comments on this? Let me just, so one of the issues then was the expectation of what we should do and be. And this is actually the kind of thing that Barbara's from was reacting to. This is a Sell Shall and Write Your game, made in 1966, the exciting career game for girls. There was also a boys' version, very similar today to the sort of pink and green aisles that we often are seeing again in big box stores, but this was sort of much more fiercely defined, so that the jobs that you could have as a woman included, ballerina, model, actress, stewardess, a nurse, or a teacher. And the game was all about, how fit you were for your job. If your makeup was too sloppy, you would not be good. An airline stewardess. Males, the game for boys included jobs like airline pilot, statesman, doctor. You get the sense. The reason I put this in is I want you to get a sense of what the vision was when they made this piece called When We Grow Up. And actually, let me have to go get this somewhere else. I'll show you this piece. This is I'm not going to be able to play the song here, but what this was a song that featured Michael Jackson and singing "What Do We Want to Be When We Grow Up," along with Melba Moore. And in fact, what he as the song was originally created, there was a discussion of wearing. The girl in the scene says, I will wear white gloves and dress up, and that was made in '72. By the time they filmed the television special, they decided they have to remake it, and so the two wind up singing and dancing in this abandoned attic, imaginary play attic, and they wind up actually coming to this point, which is actually where the final part of the scene has them putting on a helmet as if
they could both be astronauts. And to show you how unique that was, this is actually a booth that was made at the 1977 Houston Women's Conference, the first National Women's Conference, where you could actually have your photograph taken as an astronaut. And the subtitle, this is a photograph by Diana Nora Henry called Picture Yourself as an Astronaut. And this is, we forget now that we're post-Sally Ride, how unusual it was to be able to imagine even this particular piece. I'm sorry I can't show that clip because the thing about it is that Michael Jackson looks so very different. So when my students, when he sings, what I want to be happy with who I am. When we grow up, we will be, we don't care what you look like at all. It's all about who you are. They always remark how, he didn't quite listen to the words of the song. But it speaks to, I think, this sort of the way in which this project really was imagined a kind of different space. It was very smart. It was it really considered its audience to be particularly smart. This is another Steele song. And it was controversial because of the claim around Williams' desire for a doll. One of the things that Letty Pogrebin, who was the consultant on the production, said she would have changed was the way in which the grandmother was represented. She said, that's just far too soon. Here we were worried about all these stereotypes, and we forgot to think about age. And in fact, the organization, the Women's Action Alliance, in their actions were also often the first, I think they were the first group to include a representation of children with disability. And some of you will remember that they often, in these situations, women's conferences or women's presentations were often the first that were completely signed. Out of Williams' Doll, which was a Charlotte Solito book in 1972 that was reprinted in Stories for Free Children and became a song written by Mary Rogers and Sheldon Harnick, the Women's Action Alliance produced a poster that was sent around the country to preschools, and it's the same message, right? William wants a doll because he may be a father someday. We see this, I think, now, and there is a kind of heteronormativity. There's a narrative around, and in fact, the opposition to this particular issue was particularly strong when the Women's Action Alliance would organize conferences to talk about non-sexist childhood and what that meant. And there was a real fear that, in fact, if you allow boys to play with dolls, they will become homosexual. And so both Letty Cotton Pogrebin and the organizer, Barbara Sprung, would turn to literature that said what you want to do is you want to have men be nurturing and caring, because if you have rigid gender roles, then that will create homosexuality. So they used a psychological theory about flexibility and nurturing to basically restore a kind of heterosexual imperative. And so you can see that here, right? The secret fear was that, in fact, we want to encourage boys to be nurturing so that they can identify with their fathers and behave like their fathers. Some of the contributors that we asked to think about this project talked about what it meant for them. Carl Bryant is a sexuality studies professor now at SUNY New Paltz, who talks about what it meant for him to watch this, because he wanted to, play with dolls and to wear beautiful, pink, lovely dresses because they were beautiful to him. So the kind of anxiety about what that meant in terms of the education really framed, I think, some of the darker sides of this particular piece. This is actually one of the other kind of puzzles that WAA came out with, right, advocating that, in fact, William can be a doll and take him in, can be nurturing, right, was the other real concern about this particular vision. So Rosie Greer, football player, sings a beautiful song that was written by Carol Hall called It's All Right to Cry. And the songwriter for that actually talked about going to a preschool and asking children what crying means. And she
said you basically just stole their words, right? Crying gets the sad out of you. It's okay to cry. I just want to wind up a little bit by bringing up kind of the backlash of this cause. In Phyllis Schlafly's text, she actually identifies the problem with what, as she called it, women's liberationists who really wanted to encourage boys to cry in public. She couldn't understand what that was or why they insisted on that, and she really identified that as a problem, as did James Dobson, who the year after Free to Be came out, actually published Dare to Discipline. And in Dare to Discipline, he winds up turning to the same psychological theory to make a claim about creating heteronormative males. His solution, though, is not to give boys dolls, but actually to argue that you need to give boys guns to allow them to resist what he saw as the effeminizing effect of these women's liberationists who were trying to change the family. In his book, he actually, I'm trying to find the quotation here, he actually talks about how problematic, right, the Free to Be was. I'm not going to find it in time, I think. But he really saw, in fact, Free to Be as the beginning of the attack on gender roles and on the family. And in fact, in 1977 at the Houston Women's Conference, he begins to organize the group that will wind up becoming Focus on the Family. And it really is around this issue of how do we remake gender roles in the family and the anxiety that these visions for change created. And so this is actually just to sort of frame that context, the International Women's Conference with 26 planks. Some of them were about childcare and about funding, but could only manage to pass one, and yet managed to, I think, bring together a number of people to rethink what we wanted, including, unfortunately, I think, Focus on the Family and Tim and Beverly LaHaye, who would create a kind of narrative around families' values directly almost across the street in Houston. Lastly, I just want to conclude with a little bit of a surprise for me in doing this work. And the surprise was in actually finding the role that Dorothy Pittman Hughes, pictured here with Gloria Steinem, in 1970 Dan Wynn photograph, had in framing this particular event. Steinem was a reporter who interviewed Dorothy Pittman Hughes. Pittman Hughes was a childcare activist who managed to lead 300 families to occupy Mayor Lindsay's office when he decided to cut childcare in New York. And he wasn't cutting childcare for the poorest, but actually for the next poorest, the medium income parents that were at Dorothy's center. She ran a center in West 80th Street. And in fact, she led a protest because what she saw was this division that was going to reinstate class and race divisions at the one place where we seem to have been able to bridge those, and that was the child care center. So in fact, she winds up in a consciousness raising group with Marlo Thomas because of Steinem's connection, and then in fact it is her child care center that will be the site of the filming of Free to Be You and Me. Ironically, it's her children, and I'll show you a scene here in a second and I'll conclude. Her children are actually in the scene, but to inspire the next song, which is a song about equality called Brothers and Sisters, Marlo interviews the children about what their perception is of their siblings. And the African American children actually say, we love our siblings, where Abigail and Robin Cook-Rabbit have a very different narrative and a much more interesting one from the perspective of the filmmaking. So you see this work has been going on for a while. Just to conclude, there's a response by Free to Be in 1988 to some of the family values critique and some of the critique about the omissions in the first iteration called Free to Be a Family. It's released as an album and then made into a television special. The special doesn't work at all. It is supposed to be the first live hookup between kids in the United States and in the Soviet Union, and they're very excited. It's the year before the wall falls in 1989, and it's eternal in terms of the translation time from one kid to another. So it's supposed to be, it was marketed as something very exciting, but it doesn't quite take off in the way that the other one does. And the interesting omission, I think, in Free to Be a Family is that there really is an attempt to address many of the issues, including having Whoopi Goldberg tell a story about Doris, who goes to the welfare office and finds that actually a lot of her friends there, including her violin teacher and her mother's friends, and it's not the kind of negative experience that the child had been led to believe it would be. There's a song about Kermit the Frog sings about, people polluting my pond. You begin to see sort of the issues of the 80s. There is no discussion of same-sex family, ironically enough, but adoption gets introduced. So Superman is adopted, and there's a story about him as an adoptee. I think that the response to Free to Be a Family, or the reason there was felt to needed to be a response, was because of the impact of the reaction to this challenge to gender roles in terms of the family values critique. And a quick internet survey, I think right now for the phrase free to be, I think sort of exemplifies in some ways the legacy of that reaction. To give you an example, freetobeme.com is actually an organization, evangelical-based organization in Canada called New Directions for Life Ministry that actually purports to counsel people who are afflicted with same-gender attractions. And it's meant to be an ameliorative outreach, meant to foster sort of positive identification, but it I think speaks to in some ways how much things have changed, as does freetobe.net, which is if you look that up, it's an organization in California that basically has been doing abstinence-only education in the Northern California schools for about 8 years. There's an ACLU standing lawsuit against them. But I think in both cases, these organizations are speaking to the kind of language around freedom that inspired the initial vision, but with a very different outcome. And I think they're sort of speaking in some ways to the impact of the original and the call for sort of a continued, I think, examination of gender and sex roles.